Welcome to the Healers Café, conversations on health and healing with Dr. Manon.
So welcome to the Healers Café. And today I have with me Dr. Aimee, no, I didn't check your name pronunciation. Is it Apigian?
Apigian.
Apigian, okay. And she's an MD, an MS, MPH, and is the leading medical expert on how life experiences get stored in the body and restoring the body to its best state of health through her signature model and methodology called the biology of trauma. She's a double board certified medical physician in preventative medicine and addiction medicine. And she has a master's in biochemistry and a master's in public health. In addition to her medical training, she's also a certified functional medicine physician and has training and certifications specifically in neuroautoimmunity, nutrition and genetics for addiction, mental health, and mood and behavioral disorders. And she has several certifications in various trauma therapies, including the instinctual trauma response model, and art trauma therapy, somatic experiencing, and that was developed by Dr. Peter Levine, and neuroaffective touch by Dr. Aline Lapierre. So, wow, certainly you've covered every aspect that one would need to know to really serve your client at the highest degree, because you've got choices, tons of choices. So, but you tell me a little bit, how did all this start? Why did you go into this? What brought you this way?
Yeah, my story with trauma specifically started when I was in medical school. I had actually just finished my master's in biochemistry and had a few months free before I jumped back into the third year of medical school rotations. And I decided to use that time to become a foster parent. And it was not until I had restarted the medical school rotations that they actually found a placement. And so they called me and they explained that they had 4-year-old Miguel and gave me a brief history. And that's how he came into my life, my home, my heart. And I thought I knew what he needed. I thought he needed, of course, love and stability and time, and that he would be fine. At least that's also what the social workers told me.
Good.
And I had a lot to learn. And it was certainly one of the hardest experiences I've been through. And very grateful for it now, because it made me well, and I chose to, right? I chose when I adopted him. That was the commitment that I made to him, was I'm going to figure out, I'm going to do everything I can to figure out what you need in order to be happy, to find happiness, because he was clearly not happy. And I had no idea the path that it would take me down, but eventually I did find kind of all the pieces for him, and then got to go on my own journey after I got very sick and had some medical health issues myself. And of course, now that I was through medical school in general surgery residency, had finished my master's in public health, I knew that all of the symptoms and issues that I was struggling with my health were connected with the adverse childhood experiences study. And I didn't understand why, because I was not one that had ever seen trauma in my childhood. And if this had been Miguel, I would have kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, well, of course, what do you expect, right? And likely followed up with, and so there's nothing we can do about it. But because it was me, and I didn't see trauma in my childhood or history, I knew that I was missing a big piece, and I must not understand trauma, or I must not understand a critical piece here. And so I set out to not only find what that missing piece was, but then figure out if it was possible to rewire this chronic effect of stress and trauma on the body, even as an adult. And then that's eventually what became my career. And that's what I do now.
Well, it's fascinating, right? Because it's almost like in reverse, you know, and yet it themed interestingly, right? Like it's funny how, you know, it's like he was perfect for your healing as well. Like life always is kind of perfect, including the traumas. So once we get there.
Yes. Yes. It's almost like my calling found me. It came searching for me, and it created my life experiences that I would need to eventually land in and step into my calling.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So maybe I'm trying to think, why don't we talk a little bit about the difference between trauma and like the stress response. We could start with that, and then you could expand a little bit what the differences are.
This is a really important difference. And even in functional medicine or integrative medicine, we haven't really understood the difference in the physiology. And yet that difference is critical. And when we realize that there is a very specific process, a step-by-step sequence that happens with our physiology, with our nervous system, for the body to go into a trauma response, it really helps clarify things, especially as a practitioner, because otherwise we find ourselves talking about this word trauma without really defining it. And we're left with a definition of, well, some big bad event that happened to me in my past. Or if we're talking to a patient, it's whatever big bad event they had that happened in the past. But what does that even mean? Like how big, how bad? Or
Right.
if you want to talk about little t trauma, okay, well, how bad did the little t trauma need to be? So it still just creates a lot of confusion about, well, what is a qualifying event that makes me or my patient have experienced trauma?
Mhm.
And when we look at just the physiology rather than the event itself, it clarifies everything. So would love to just walk through that physiological process that happens. So this would be the body's trauma response.
Mhm.
And the body has a stress response. And I think that everyone is very familiar when that adrenaline hits you, like that is the initiation of your stress response. And to go into the stress response, we first have a startle. And for many people, they're not even aware of that startle because it just so quickly moves on into the full stress response. But there actually always is that first step of a startle. I get startled by something in my sensory world, a sound, something I see, something I smell, whatever it is, there's always a startle step first. So that's the first step. And then we have a few seconds for our nervous system to collect more information about it before it decides, no, like this actually is a real threat and we need to turn on the full stress response. And when it turns on that full stress response, it moves all of the signaling over to our sympathetic chain that runs down our back. This is actually before anything else has happened. We talk about the HPA axis turning on, but the HPA axis hasn't even turned on yet. That comes later. The first step in the stress response is this sympathetic chain and it communicating to the adrenal glands, hey, we need adrenaline. Start making adrenaline. So adrenaline hits our system about 30 seconds after a stress response has been alerted. Now that adrenaline is going to stay in our body for about 15 minutes. It's a wave, a surge of adrenaline. And then we have cortisol turn on. So that's when our HPA axis is turning on. Now, how do we get from this then to the trauma response? The trauma response is communicated through a different branch of our nervous system. It's not going to be communicated through the sympathetic chain. That is only the stress response. It only knows how to turn on the stress response and to initiate adrenaline. The trauma response then is initiated by two triggers. When that stress response has been activated, if whatever is going on feels like it's too much too fast, or we are in a situation where it feels just like it's been too little of something that we need for just too long. Those are the two triggers that our body will say, we're not big enough for this. We're not strong enough for this. We're not smart enough for this. We're not fill in the blank enough for this. And our better strategy for surviving this moment in time is actually to shut down. If we were driving a car, that stress response would be if our foot is on that gas pedal and it is all the way down. And so the car is speeding up, the engine is revving up. This is where if we're not careful, we can burn out our engine, we can burn out our transmission, we can get into serious trouble. And that's why the stress response is only meant to be temporary. We're not meant to drive our life in that accelerator mode all the time. But when the trauma response happens in the body, it would be the equivalent of us throwing on the emergency brake. It's a completely different system. I'm not taking my foot off the gas pedal to put on the brake pedal. That would be what we call the parasympathetic system. This is a completely different system of the body that even if our foot is still on the gas pedal, it doesn't matter because the emergency brake is more powerful than the gas pedal. Our trauma response is more powerful than our stress response. And so for any reason that at that time, our body gets overwhelmed and has that thought, or I want to say comes to that conclusion that I don't think I'm enough for this, it goes into the trauma response. And this is where the communication immediately stops going down the sympathetic chain, and instead it comes down the vagus nerve. Now, this is not the vagus nerve, the ventral parasympathetic that you think of, which is your social engagement, your rest and digest. No, this is not that communication down the vagus nerve. This is actually communicated through a different nucleus in the medulla where the vagus nerve originates. So in your brainstem, the lowest region of the brainstem is that medulla. And this is where it controls your autonomic functions of your body. So your heart rate, your breathing, all of your digestive system, like it controls all of these automatic functions. And of course, that's where your vagus nerve originates from. Without that medulla, without that vagus nerve, we would not be able to survive life. But the vagus nerve does not just have one nucleus as its origin. It actually has several. And the dorsal nucleus, so just meaning the one that's behind all the others, that is the one where the trauma response gets communicated. And this is when everything will shut down. And you'll be standing there perhaps, and someone will say something to you, criticize you. I remember being a general surgery resident, and I would be standing there in the operating room, and maybe I had forgotten to do something, or maybe whatever. And this person who's big and important, and I really had wanted to do everything perfect and please them, and they start chewing me out. And I immediately just go into that shutdown space. And inside, I become super small. Of course, on the outside, I'm standing there. You probably wouldn't know that I'm shutting down inside, but that's exactly what happens when our body goes into the trauma response, is it just constricts and it just shuts down. It collapses. We can start to feel like our brain just kind of goes offline. Our body kind of goes offline. Everything gets off. And that is the physiology of the trauma response. So that when we're in a stress response, our foot is on the gas pedal. This is actually when we have high energy, high energy. This is where we can actually do like superhuman strength stuff. Right. The mom who lifts the car off of her child who's pinned underneath, the firefighter who runs towards the building on fire and saves people and has never been able to do anything close to that when he works out on for his daily exercise routine. This is when we have more focus, we have more energy, we have more aliveness than any other time. And people who are stressed, or I should say, think that they are stressed, but don't have energy, that's actually their body being in the trauma response.
What would your life be like if you were pain-free? If you were one of the millions who suffer from chronic pain, the thought of just one day without it may seem impossible. This is often because conventional medicine tends to fall short in the treatment of pain, opting to prescribe pills or recommend surgery rather than getting to the root cause of the problem. But if you are suffering with emotional or physical pain, there is hope. Join the founder and CEO of Bowen College, Manon Bolliger, live online for your body-mind reboot. Learn how to listen to your symptoms and get to the root cause of your pain. Plus, be trained in basic Bowen therapy moves so that you can reboot your body for optimal health. You don't have to live in pain. You can heal. Stop the pain pill cycle by visiting www.yourbodymindreboot.com to learn more and to register.
This is most people. Most people are overwhelmed and they're doing things to try to deal with the overwhelm. Maybe they're scrolling on social media. Maybe they're mindlessly watching TV. Maybe they are doing some eating or grabbing that second glass of wine or whatever it is that they're doing, but they're not in high energy. They're in low energy. They feel overwhelmed by it. That is actually their body being in a trauma response, not in a stress response.
Mhm. So, I mean, you've explained this so beautifully. It's really, I can see it very, very clearly. It's rare to have such clear explanations of this. When I'm thinking, though, the parasympathetic response that, people try to elicit by taking deep breaths and becoming present and all that, from the way you're explaining it, that typically, I mean, it might impact, but it's not really the impact to the dorsal vagus nerve. That can't really touch it because it's more to do with the sympathetic stress response.
Exactly.
So when you're dealing with the trauma response and this overwhelm freeze reaction, what have you found to be the most helpful way, because that does happen, right? People, I mean, a lot. I think a lot of people are in that state, so what is the way in to help people that that you have found to be effective or that you've possibly created?
This is really important. Whether, again, you're working on your own system and noticing, oh, like my body's going into the trauma response, or whether you're working with a patient and you can see that they're just overwhelmed and they're, in front of you and there's no chance that they're even hearing what you're telling them, let alone going to be able to follow up with the instructions that you're giving them. What I would love to be able to say is that you can just talk to them and help them snap out of it. And that's just not true. So what we have to do, there are 3 things that the trauma response needs. Once the body goes into that place, there's 3 things that it needs. It needs a felt sense of safety. This is coming a lot out of the work of Dr. Steve Porges, the polyvagal theory, where it's been very clear that the body goes into that place when it feels like the stress, the danger, the threat is inescapable. And if it's inescapable, I don't want to be here.
Mhm.
I don't want to feel this. And so I'm just going to disconnect. I'm just going to do things mindlessly. I'm going to try not to feel my body and feel the discomfort of being in something that feels completely inescapable. And bringing in that felt sense of safety of actually right now, like the danger is gone. The threat is gone. You're safe. But what happens is that most people don't even know what it feels like to be safe.
Mhm, mhm.
They're trying to tell themselves that they feel safe. They're trying to tell themselves that they should feel safe. Maybe they even go to yoga or meditation or say mantras or affirmations that all tell them that they are safe, but it's not an experience of the body.
Yeah.
Like it's not actually the body feeling safe. It's the brain still trying to convince the body. And that's not the way it works. The body has felt experiences, and the body is what needs to inform the brain that, hey, we're safe down here. We're good. You can focus on other things. But as long as the body feels insecure, unsafe, it's going to stay in this place. The other thing that the trauma response needs is energy. So one of the reasons why the body even goes into a trauma response is because it doesn't have enough resources. If it had more energy, it would have been able to fight longer. If it had more energy, it would have been able to stay in that stress and let's go, let's solve this problem, let's take action. But it went into that trauma response because it's like, I don't have enough energy for that. That mountain is too big for me. That problem, oh no, that's too big for me. And so trauma is an energy problem, and it causes energy problems. It causes damage to our mitochondria, starts to build up oxidative stress, not only outside of our cells, but inside of our cells. And just by the fact that the body is in the trauma response, it also shuts down our detoxification system. So we're not even cleaning up that oxidative stress. So there's so many things that just start to accumulate that drain our body's energy. And so we need to come in and we need to provide it energy. The other thing that the trauma response needs is time. And we see this even from the animal kingdom. And so if you're studying how animals go into their freeze response, right? Maybe you're watching an antelope being chased by a cheetah, whatever. And in this circumstance, the antelope is going to get away, but he freezes when that cheetah goes to pounce on him. And then the cheetah, goes and chases someone else thinking that this one is dead. It takes time. Like that antelope just doesn't jump up immediately. Like it goes into this dormant hibernation. And all animals that do this, that's they just lay there. Like it's a time thing. Their body has to have time, and then it resets, and then it wakes up, and then it's like, oh, okay, time to go. And that's exactly what our body does as well. When it goes into this trauma response, it's almost like it gets stunned. It's a shock. And it's like, it's got to process that shock before it comes out of that and kind of lifts its head up and is like, oh, it's over. Hopefully it gets the message that it's over, which is why we have to provide it that felt sense of safety, so that when the body is waking up out of that trauma response, it does get the sense that all is well, all is safe, and I really can come out of this place of shutdown and collapse.
So when you see animals, because we have lots of animals around here who are nearly killed, but they stop and they freeze. I mean, often, they don't move, and you think, okay, now move, because there's going to be another car if you're not careful. But often it ends with this kind of like shaking of their whole body, right? Which is again a very physical release response. And I think humans do it instinctively, but we've been cultured into like, oh, that's too weird, But what's your take on that?
So what's happening is that they're discharging adrenaline. And that's what needs to be done in order for there not to be the long-term consequences to their physiology. And what they're doing is they are completing a response. And in the animal kingdom, they complete a stress response. And if they go into a trauma response, they complete that trauma response. As humans, we don't tend to do either. We don't tend to complete our stress responses, which takes us into the trauma response. And then we don't really complete a trauma response. And so we're now kind of chronically living in this place of going in and out of the trauma and stress response and back and forth between the two. But that adrenaline needs to be discharged in order for us to complete a response and have that reset of coming back to baseline, coming back to health. Otherwise, that adrenaline creates a charge, and it causes a lot of damage to our tissues. This is where over time, you start to accumulate more muscle damage, more tissue damage, extracellular matrix damage, and you can start to have symptoms of chronic pain, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. It's because of these changes to our biology that are caused from that adrenaline and then from going into the trauma response. And so becoming immobile and not discharging this adrenaline that was there to tell us to move, to take action, but instead we shut down.
Mhm.
So it's so important to know that there is this aspect of adrenaline that needs to be discharged. There's lots of different ways that we can help discharge adrenaline. We can even do different things with our diet. If we know that we are a person who tends to be experiencing a lot of stress and so a lot of adrenaline, we can actually eat certain foods that help metabolize adrenaline. But at the end of the day, we also need to be moving and be in movement in proportion to the amount of adrenaline that we are creating every day.
Interesting. Yeah. So how do you think we became so disconnected? Because I've certainly seen human beings do this, have this urge, right? And, yeah, if you're going to judge it, you're going to say, what are they doing? But, I'm more grateful that, wow, there are still humans doing this. But why do you think we became, as a general culture, general statement, so disconnected?
From my perspective, what I've seen is there is the larger threat of what would people think of me.
Interesting.
And we are by nature social creatures. We know that we need other people to survive, even though we can have this attachment tension for sure. And so it's always in the back of our mind of, well, what do I need to do to not get kicked out of the group? What do I need to do in order to be normal enough?
Right.
And I was thinking about this just the other day. I went hiking with my dog, Amada, and she's a all black, medium-sized Belgian Shepherd. We were way up into the hills. And so I took her off leash and we're walking and a coyote crosses the path, about 30 feet in front of us. And coyotes, they're so egotistical. He just kind of slowly, struts across the path like, this is my territory and I know exactly what I'm doing. Now, of course, if you know anything about coyotes, that's exactly what they do. They lure a dog away and then they lure them right into the middle of their pack. And then that's how they get them. And so, of course, my dog being a shepherd, she takes off after this coyote. Talk about stress for me, right? Like I am now in this stress mode and I'm calling her name and I'm running towards where she bolted into the shrubbage and I can hear some growling and I'm just like, oh my goodness, right? Stress. Now, thankfully, she pops out and she emerges and she's all happy. All is good. Mom, look at me. I chased this coyote away. I'm keeping you safe. Aren't I the best dog ever? I, of course, am like, oh, right. Like I need to now complete this stress response. But here's what happens. If we're with other people or if we don't know this, we would just be like, oh, well, let me just keep walking, right? Stress is over. Let me just keep walking. Let me pretend that everything is fine now. No, adrenaline had surged through my whole bloodstream. Even though I had used my legs to run, I hadn't used my arms much. And so here I am up in the middle of the hills and I'm like, okay, what does my body need? What does my body need? And I'm like, I can still feel all this energy. And so I started moving my arms and it was almost like I moved my arms as if I were fighting the coyote off myself. Right. And I'm like, no, you're going to get away. You're going to get away from my dog. And I did that until I felt complete, which was for about 15 seconds. Now, if anybody had been watching me, they would be like, oh my goodness, like what a lunatic out there all by herself, like flailing her arms. But it was a very intentional movement. And that's what's important also to discharge adrenaline and complete a stress response. But it allowed me to then, again, kind of stop and sense like my body. And I got this deep, spontaneous breath. My shoulders came down. I could feel that the stress just kind of left me. And that's what we need to do in order to discharge a stress response. But what most people do is that they kind of look around being like, who's watching me?
Yeah.
and let me pretend that, oh, ha, 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 yeah, no, that didn't bother me at all. That's true. Like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, we have this adrenaline, it needs to be discharged. And I would love for it to just become common practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we give more attention to what our thoughts and our mind says than what our body, and it's our body that actually governs all this. So,
Yes.
yeah. So we're actually out of time. that's it. But it's been just a wealth of information, and yeah, so much. So how do people? I saw that you have a 21-day journey for people available on your website. We're going to put the links. Is there any closing statement you'd like to make?
That would be my encouragement to people, is for them to just become curious and actually become the expert in their own body. That is my process with the 21-day journey, is actually helping people understand their trauma response and start to learn how to work with it in a healthy way. So that is the 21-day journey, a very specific process to start working with a body that's in a chronic trauma response. But my words of hope would be that there's so much that we can do. We just haven't known. And especially when we can understand the difference between stress and trauma, we can recognize just how much we have lived our lives in trauma, and know that there are tools that we can change that, and relatively very quickly.
Thank you for joining us at the Healers Café with Dr. Manon.